Now, speaking of interesting topics, I got into an interesting conversation the other day with a medical professional, shall we say. 80-year-old man, well educated, lives in New York, proudly Jewish, big family, and I mention all of that because this is the context of the conversation. And he said, hey, what's up? What have you been doing? So I very happily shared with him this idea of the opera project that we are doing in order to bring deaf audiences into live opera performances and have those performances interpreted in American Sign Language. And almost immediately, this highly active, culturally sensitive, well-educated man said to me, oh, no. Opera is not for the deaf. And I was really sort of surprised and taken aback as I sat there and I started to get uncomfortable. Not really angry or mad because I've heard it all before, but surprised and a little bit disappointed. And in our ongoing effort to try to get the Metropolitan Opera in New York City to stand up and do the right thing and provide interpreted performances for the deaf, we've had meetings with them, and it surprises me we even have to have a meeting about the possibility of including deaf people in the audience. To me, the meeting should be, hey, we're having a meeting because we need to fix this. Let's do it. Let's put on a show. But no. Well, people are complaining. Well, the opera. So as this 80-year-old medical doctor is going on and on about how the deaf people don't belong at the opera, I'm thinking, okay, this is a good test for me to see if I can calmly relate why this very intelligent, smart, kind man is so wrong. Because this is probably the same kind of conversation that we're going to have with opera companies locally, across the nation, and all over the world. The deaf don't belong at the opera. The opera is not for the deaf. So I asked my doctor, I said, this certain doctor, why? And of course he went on to pontificate, well, the opera is all about, the different notes, the high notes, the low notes, the medium notes. Deaf people can't hear the differences in tone of voice, so why would they even want to go? And if you do ask, deaf communities, strong deaf people about the opera, they'll most likely say they're not interested in going. And why is that? It's because they've never had the opportunity to be included. So, because there's no effort to make inclusion a part of the dynamic, the deaf say, well, I don't want to go to the opera because they don't want me. And the opera says, well, why would we want to put up with deaf people in the opera? Now, we don't believe in separate but equal anymore here in the United States. Some people try to press that, and some people don't. And this whole, by the way, Donald Trump thing, is very interesting. And how he's being tried on, a lot of these radical things for January 6th that go all the way back to the Civil War. And the history of it is very interesting, where President Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, the winner of the Civil War, who defeated the South, as president realized that the South lost the war against their want to enslave people. And so to get around their loss on the battlefield, they decided to create laws, policies, legislation in the South that sort of reestablished slavery in America. So they lost the war, and then they're going to try to fix it. So they won the war by legislation that punishes people of color. And Grant wasn't having it, and he went back to Washington, D.C. and said, look, this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to change the outcome of their loss in the war to make it a win politically. And we cannot, as a nation, allow that to happen. And so laws were passed. You cannot exclude people. You must not threaten people. All of these things that were... And that's what's being used now to prosecute Trump for what he tried to do in overturning a free and fair election. So with that in mind, we go back to this idea of this medical doctor friend who says the opera is not for the deaf because they can't hear the music. And so I said to my doctor friend, you know, the deaf really love music. And he said, what? What? And I said, yeah, it's true. Deaf people especially like music that thumps. And deaf people communicate with their eyes. They hear through their eyes. So if you're going to the Grand Opera with big sets and big lights and big stages and singing that is being interpreted visually with hand shapes and facial expression, it becomes a full, immersive experience for deaf people at the opera. And he kind of looked at me like he was, thinking, and he's very declarative. He knows this, he knows this, he knows this, bump, bump, bump. That's it. Conversation over, because he's old and he knows. And so we continued our conversation, and I did not say this to him, but I'm saying it to you now. If other people had that idea that he expressed to me, that deaf people do not belong at the opera because they cannot hear the music, why wouldn't someone try to say, and a lot of people did say, about people like, say, Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf? If you were to follow that thought pattern, the deaf don't belong at the opera because they can't hear it, then wouldn't you also say, well, people like Helen Keller, well, they can't see, they can't hear, they can't interact with the world, so why would you try to communicate? Why would you bring in an Anne Sullivan to take this disabled person and make them a part of the world in which they could contribute interesting, thoughtful books, phrases, and experiences? Because it's the same thing. So I'm very grateful that we don't have people who say, oh, Helen Keller doesn't belong in the world because she can't hear it and she can't see it. So we're just going to leave her over there in the corner where she can just sit in her own mind for the next 50 years until she dies. That's the thinking that goes into saying, oh, the deaf don't belong at the opera. Even though they can see and feel vibrations, because they can't hear these subtle differences in tone, which can be related visually, we don't want them at the opera. So I, sort of made some of these comments to him at the end of our conversation. He said, well, you've given me some things to think about. Now, when I go back, is he going to bring this up and say he thought about it? No. Am I going to bring it up and ask if he thought about it some more? No. Why? Because I know he doesn't like to be wrong. Secondly, I don't know if he really cares. I think, there are people who just like to pontificate. This is the way it is. Deaf people do not belong at the opera. Thank you for giving me something to think about. But I do know that people who run opera companies, there are probably people in an opera company who have that mindset because they don't know any better. And they're well-educated and well-trained and culturally sensitive. And to be really crass about it, you could say, well, historically, operas have only been for white people. Because they were written by white people, starring white people. So people of color who want to be in an opera, why? It's not historically accurate. It's not for them. They have their own culture, their own way of being participated. And we don't stand for that today, right? And many of the major opera companies, especially in the United States and at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City, are adding people of color to their cast, as they should, and in their administration, as they should, because we want our world and our culture and our learning and our understanding to be inclusive and to include everybody. And not to take certain people and point at them and say, well, this isn't for you, and this isn't for you. So you go over there and you go over there, and we're going to have our thing here. Now, there are people who believe that. People who know better, who want to believe that. And why? The answer is because it's easier for them. It's not an easy thing to go to the Metropolitan Opera in New York City and say, we're going to have interpreted performances. The cast has to be on board, the conductor, the musicians. It's a big thing. Yes is hard. No is very easy. No is no thank you. We don't need it. The deaf don't belong here. People of color, well, historically, we lost the Civil War, but we can pass legislation and we can gerrymander so we can get the same result as if we had won the war. And we need more people like General Grant to stand up and say, that's not happening. You lost the war, you're wrong on the facts, and now we're going to have to pass legislation, federal legislation, because of you and because of what you did to people. It's a nasty, treacherous, awful thing. And we can only try to become better for it and because of it, in order to try to fix what has been broken by ill-thinking people. And then we're going to take a very brief break, returning in just a moment.